Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling one of the biggest questions you can possibly ask. Where did life actually come from? It's a journey that's going to take us from the very beginning of the universe all the way to a tiny chemical spark right here on planet Earth. All right, let's get into it. You know, our story doesn't even start on Earth. We have to go way, way back, billions of years, into the unimaginable emptiness of space. I love this quote because it's so true. The light from those stars has been traveling for millions, sometimes billions of years, just to reach our eyes. So when you look up at the night sky, you are literally looking back in time. So, to really get this, we've got to wrap our heads around some seriously big numbers. The universe itself is about 13.8 billion years old. Just let that sink in. Our planet, Earth, well, it's kind of a newcomer, showing up around 4.5 billion years ago. And then, and this is wild, life appears just 500 million years later. I know that sounds like a long time, but on a cosmic scale, that's practically the blink of an eye. Understanding this deep time, as scientists call it, is absolutely crucial. All right, so let's zoom in on that first chapter of our story. How in the world do we go from the birth of, well, everything, to our little blue planet, this tiny speck in the universe where life could actually take hold? It all kicks off with the Big Bang. One single, unbelievably massive explosion. It's almost impossible to really picture it, right? And from that single moment, everything started expanding and cooling down, and guess what? It's still doing it, right now, as we speak. Okay, now let's hit the fast forward button by about 9 billion years. And boom, we get Earth. But listen, this was not the nice, comfy plane that we live on now. No way. Picture a fiery, molten ball of rock, constantly getting pummeled by asteroids, covered in volcanoes, just spewing out gases like methane, ammonia, and water vapor. A totally toxic, violent world. So how did we get from that hellscape to, well, here? An incredible chain of events had to happen. First, the sun was blasting the planet with UV rays, which literally split water molecules apart. The hydrogen, being super light, just floated off into space. But the oxygen stuck around. And this was the game changer. It combined with other gases and eventually formed the ozone layer, our planet's sunblock. Once that shield was up, things could finally cool down. All that water vapor in the air started to condense, and it began to rain. And it didn't just rain for an afternoon. It rained for centuries, forming the very first oceans. So, the stage is set. We've got a planet with oceans and a protective atmosphere. But now for the million-dollar question. How could life possibly begin in that primordial soup? Well, for a really long time, two main ideas were battling it out. On one hand, you had panspermia, the theory that life came from outer space, maybe as tiny spores that seeded our planet. On the other hand, you had spontaneous generation. This is the idea that life just pops into existence from non-living stuff. You know, like flies from rotting meat or mice from a pile of straw. People really believed this. And that idea, spontaneous generation, was the leading theory for ages. I mean, it kind of makes sense from what people saw every day. But it was about to run into a major, major problem. And that problem's name was Louis Pasteur. Pasteur's experiment was just so elegant. He took 2 flasks of broth, boiled them both to kill anything inside, and sealed one up tight. The other one, he left it open to the air. The result? The sealed flask stayed perfectly clear. The open one got all cloudy and gross. He proved it. Life doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It comes from other, pre-existing life. So yeah, Pasteur totally slammed the door on spontaneous generation. Done. Finished. But in doing that, he basically backed science into a corner. I mean, think about it. If life only comes from other life, then where on Earth did the very first life come from? It's a massive paradox. And that giant question, the one Pasteur left us with, is what brings us to our modern leading theory. The idea that life didn't start with a bang. It didn't just appear fully formed. Maybe it started with the ingredients first, a process we call chemical evolution. This idea, from 2 scientists named Oparin-Haldane, was pretty radical. They basically said, hey, what if the line between a rock and a rabbit isn't a hard wall, but a slow, gradual process? First, simple, non-living chemicals get cooked up into more complex, organic molecules, the building blocks. Then, over a long, long time, those building blocks start to organize themselves into the very first forms of life. Now, for a while, that was just a really cool theory. Made sense, but there was no proof. But then, in 1953, 2 scientists, Miller and Urey, decided to stop talking and start experimenting.
They asked a simple question. Can we actually make the building blocks of life right here in a lab from scratch?
So they built this crazy-looking glass contraption, a miniature early Earth in a bottle. They filled it with the gases they thought were around back then: methane, hydrogen, ammonia. They boiled some water to create vapor, like an early ocean, and then they zapped the whole thing with electric sparks to simulate lightning. They let this experiment run for just 1 week, and when they checked the water at the bottom, they couldn't believe it. The water was full of amino acids. So what's the big deal? Well, amino acids are literally the building blocks of proteins. And proteins are the tiny little machines that run everything inside our cells. This was a revolutionary moment. For the first time ever, the origin of life wasn't just philosophy anymore. It was something you could actually test in a lab. And the evidence kept piling up. Other scientists ran similar experiments and made other crucial stuff: sugars, fats, you name it. But here's where it gets really mind-blowing. Scientists started analyzing meteorites, rocks from outer space. And guess what they found inside them? The same kinds of amino acids. That's huge. It means the ingredients for life aren't some special thing that only happened here. This could be happening all over the universe. Okay, so we have the ingredients, the building blocks are there, floating around in this primordial soup. But that brings us to the next big mystery. How do you go from a soup of chemicals to an actual living cell? And full disclosure, this is the part of the story where things get a little fuzzy. We don't have all the answers yet. The best guess is that around 3 billion years ago, some of these molecules got complex enough to start making copies of themselves. Then, over another billion years, these self-copy molecules got wrapped up inside little protective bubbles. And that was probably the first cell. This whole story, this incredible journey from simple, non-living chemicals all the way to the first cell, is what scientists call biogenesis. The powerful idea here is that the origin of life wasn't a miracle. It was just chemistry and physics doing their thing over billions and billions of years. And this is by far the most widely accepted explanation we have today. But you know what? Creating that first tiny cell, that wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. In fact, it was just the beginning, because it opens up the next giant question. How did that one single, simple cell give rise to everything else? To trees, to dinosaurs, to us? And that is an incredible story, but it's one we'll have to save for another time.